July 1944. Somewhere in the wide, flat heart of the American Midwest, a canvas-covered truck grinds to a halt. Dust billows. German prisoners climb down one by one, sunburnt, uniforms faded, eyes adjusting to a land they had only heard about through propaganda, a place of excess, of supposed decay. They stand before a fence that looks almost temporary. Wooden guard towers, a lazy American flag catching a summer breeze. Not the infernal camps they imagined, not the hunger or the screaming, just waiting. Inside, the heat is thick. Cicadas drone, and then the smell. Cold air hisses from a metal canteen door as it swings open. Behind the counter, stacked in neat rows, glass bottles glisten with condensation. Coca-Cola. Next to them, tubs packed in dry ice, vanilla, chocolate, ice cream. In the middle of a world war. A young prisoner holds the bottle handed to him, feeling the chill through glass. He hesitates. This is the enemy. This is the country bombing their cities. He lifts it to his lips anyway. The first taste is sweet, sharp, impossible. And in that moment, everything he thought he understood about America begins to melt, just like the ice cream waiting in his other hand. War sweeps men farther than they ever expect. For tens of thousands of German soldiers, the path to a Coca-Cola bottle did not begin in a peaceful Midwestern camp. It began under a sun that could kill. North Africa, 1942-43. The Afrika Korps fought across sand and stone, first victorious under Rommel, then squeezed tight as Allied logistics and air power grew unstoppable. When Tunis fell in May 1943, more than 150,000 German and Italian troops laid down their arms. It was the largest mass surrender of German forces up to that point, and it forced a brutal logistical question. Where do you put the enemy when Europe is already a battlefield? Britain was crowded with captured men. Prisoner compounds strained food supplies, housing, and security. And more Germans were coming. From Sicily, from Salerno, from Normandy, from the hedgerows of France and the snows of the Hürtgen forest, the United States answered. Across the Atlantic, an industrial giant had awoken. America possessed room, vast stretches of farmland, forests, and military installations far from front lines or sabotage-sensitive targets. It also possessed something else, a belief that the 1929 Geneva Convention mattered. Washington insisted that if U.S. soldiers were to be treated decently in German hands, the United States would lead by example. So the transports began. Liberty ships packed with men who once wore the swastika disembarked at ports like Norfolk, Boston, and New Orleans. Barbed wire waiting at the ends of long rail lines. Camps rising in Texas, Kansas, Georgia, Colorado. More than 600 major and branch camps in total. By 1945, the U.S. would hold over 425,000 Axis prisoners of war, most of them German. Processing was brisk. Name, rank, serial number. Confiscate weapons. Photograph faces still carrying the dust of battle. Some prisoners arrived gaunt and battered. Survivors of Allied firepower or sickness in retreat. Others looked almost polished, especially veterans of the early war years who had carried themselves with an aura of invincibility. They learned quickly that swagger was pointless here. The guards had seen plenty of elite troops by now. The trains rolled inland, sometimes for days. Windows shuttered, destinations unknown. Prisoners stared through slats at an America that seemed to go on forever. Oceans of wheat, tiny farm towns, neon signs promising comforts they had not known in years, and always the shock, civilians waving. Children watching the trains pass, nothing like the indoctrinated nightmare of a starving enemy homeland they had imagined. Upon arrival, each man received a bunk in a long barrack-style hut, simple wood frames, pot-bellied stoves, mosquito screens. Not luxury, but clean, dry, safe. Clothing was replaced with denim-style work uniforms stamped PW. Meals were served at regular hours. Hot food, astonishing amounts of it. Bread that didn't taste like sawdust. Meat more than once a week. Coffee, the kind Germans only dreamed of since rationing had begun. Every part of camp life was regulated under Geneva rules. Soldiers kept their ranks. NCOs did not perform manual labor. Officers dined separately. Work was mandatory only for enlisted men and only on non-military tasks. And crucially, work meant pay. Not actual dollars, but camp currency, POW scrip. Paper coupons printed specifically so prisoners couldn't buy bus tickets to Mexico or Iowa. But inside the wire, scrip had power. Enough of it bought tobacco, stationery, postcards, toiletries, and at many camps, treats, which brings us close to the heart of this story. To supply American troops, the U.S. Army Quartermaster Corps maintained robust distribution of comfort goods. Soft drinks and ice cream weren't luxuries, they were morale insurance. So when the Americans allowed POWs to shop in the same canteens, with appropriate restrictions, those prisoner wallets became tiny windows into U.S. abundance. The absurdity wasn't lost on the captured men. In the barracks at night, conversations clashed. Was this a trick? Propaganda? A temporary show? How could the enemy afford to feed prisoners better than some German civilians now living under constant bombing? Whispers spread. If this is how they treat those who fought them. What else isn't true? Still, the psychological shift was slow. Many remained fiercely loyal to Hitler. Others feared speaking honestly under watchful compatriots. And nearly all expected to go home soon, believing Germany still stood strong. But outside the wire, Allied forces advanced relentlessly. The Reich that had once promised triumph was shrinking. Supplies in Germany were collapsing. Families wrote of hunger, rubble, and air raid sirens that never seemed to stop. Inside the camps, however, the world felt inverted, defeated soldiers surrounded by ease and calm. That contrast would prove more powerful than any leaflet dropped from a plane. And as daily routine settled, morning roll calls, work details, and evenings in canteen lines, the stage was set for a deeper confrontation. Not with rifles or artillery, but with ideas, habits, and the quiet weight of comfort. Soon the prisoners would not just live in America. They would begin to experience it, which leads us directly to the rhythms, rules, and small freedoms behind the fence. Daily life in an American prisoner of war camp moved with a rhythm surprisingly similar to a quiet military garrison, minus the battles. Dawn cracked with a whistle or the clatter of boots on wooden floors. Roll call formed long lines of denim-clad men under the watchful eyes of guards, rifles slung low. Then came breakfast, oatmeal, powdered eggs, fresh fruit when available. More calories than many had seen since before Stalingrad. Some prisoners joked the Americans were trying to fatten them for some unknown purpose. But the truth was simpler. The United States had the farmland, the factories, and the logistics to keep even its enemies fed. After breakfast, the enlisted men marched out to work. America suffered a labor shortage. Millions of citizens were overseas, and farms and factories at home demanded hands. Under the Geneva Convention, prisoners could contribute. Paid labor, non-military. Supervised. So German POWs picked cotton in Texas heat, harvested wheat in Kansas wind, repaired rail lines in Colorado snow, and felled timber in the thick forests of the Pacific Northwest. Many worked alongside civilians who had never met a German in their lives. Some farmers offered sandwiches or lemonade as thanks. Others kept their distance, wary of the swastika still vivid in recent memory. Pay was modest, but meaningful. With a handful of scrip, a man could visit the camp canteen, the closest thing to civilian life behind the wire. And this is where worlds collided. Canteens stocked what America had in astonishing quantities. Shaving gear, postcard cigarettes, and treats, the kind of indulgences that rationed Germany had left behind years ago. Soda, chocolate, occasionally even ice cream. Frozen dessert, in a world war, to a European soldier, it was as if America fought with a refrigerator at its back. This wasn't universal or daily everywhere. Some camps had seasonal ice cream, others only on special deliveries or holidays. But the very notion that the enemy could enjoy something so frivolous stunned many prisoners. It became a topic of hushed barracks debate. A Coca-Cola cost so little here. Back home, mothers waited hours for bread. The contrast was undeniable. The Reich had taken them to Africa and Russia for glory. The Americans took them to the movies on Saturday night. Yes, movies. Projectors rigged in mess halls, sometimes outdoor screens under warm evenings. Westerns were favorites. At first, POWs scoffed. Later, they applauded. Cowboys didn't care about politics. Cowboys fought the desert and the open sky, battles every soldier understood. Recreation expanded. Soccer matches with homemade goals, chess tournaments, woodshop crafts sold in small exhibitions to earn extra scrip. Some men took English classes, taught by fellow prisoners or American volunteers. Others joined camp orchestras, the notes of Beethoven floating past searchlights. Religion, too, persisted. Chaplains, both German and American, held Sunday services. Crosses carved from scrap wood lined the edges of makeshift sanctuaries. Letters home were permitted, though censored. Many wrote of surprise, even disbelief. We are treated well. Food every day. The guards are polite. Tell mother not to worry. I am safe. We have Coca-Cola here. Can you believe it? But while the camp was designed for humane confinement, it was still a prison. The fence never disappeared. Watchtowers cast long shadows. Night brought silence broken by footsteps on gravel, the metallic jingle of keys. Escape attempts existed, some bold, some foolish. A few men made it dozens of miles, only to surrender at the sight of endless land and no sympathetic contacts. Not all prisoners accepted this new reality with grace. Hardline Nazis policed loyalty within the barracks, sometimes violently. Quiet men who enjoyed an American treat too openly risked accusations of betrayal. Ideology did not melt as quickly as ice cream, yet the longer men stayed, the more the routines softened their defenses. Work built trust. Recreation built familiarity. The simple act of choosing how to spend scrip, however limited, restored a sliver of autonomy. Most importantly, word spread, between bunk beds, across fences, in letters that would eventually reach German villages. America was not what they had been told. Still, the camps existed within strict rules and watchful administration. Behind every small freedom lay careful planning and deeper intentions. Because while the U.S. fed, housed, and entertained its prisoners, it also aimed to influence them. Humane treatment wasn't only compassion, it was strategy, and now with the stage set inside the wire, we can examine the many angles of this remarkable confrontation, where culture, psychology, and practicality intersected in surprising ways. The human collision war teaches soldiers to hate an enemy they've never met, but captivity forces them to meet him. For many German POWs, the first shock was not the barbed wire, it was the smiles. American guards called them kraut with a smirk, not a snarl. Farmers who depended on their labor treated them like working men, not devils. Children pressed wildflowers through fences, curious rather than afraid. Inside the camps, humanity returned in small, disarming fragments. A soldier from Bavaria tasted peanut butter for the first time and gagged, then asked for more. Another wrote home describing Coca-Cola as liquid caramel with bubbles. Some scratched dates into wall planks, marking the days until they might earn another scoop of ice cream. In Germany, Allied bombs fell nightly. Here at dusk, music drifted from a radio in the guard shack. Big bands, crooners, a world away from artillery. These human touches sparked internal conflict. Could the enemy be normal, friendly, generous? For Nazis who believed deeply in their own propaganda, kindness was suspicious. For others, it was liberating. They laughed at American comedy shorts and felt a guilty warmth. It was the slow eroding of the mental front line, where the war had always been most deeply entrenched, and it was only beginning. The legal and moral architecture, American treatment wasn't improvisation or blind generosity. It was bound by international law and national principle. Under the 1929 Geneva Convention, POWs were to be fed the same basic rations as the detaining nation's own soldiers, provided medical care, allowed correspondence, paid for labor, protected from violence, humiliation, and coercion. This framework became a moral battlefield in itself. Washington insisted if Germans treated captured Americans decently, it would be in part because U.S. compliance set a precedent. If Germany mistreated them, America held the moral high ground to demand justice. Inspections by neutral Swiss delegations reinforced accountability. Camps prepared carefully before each visit, but they didn't need to fake food rations or clothing inventories. The system, while imperfect, was fundamentally designed to meet obligations. Of course, perfection never existed. Some camps experienced overcrowding, discipline issues, or frictions with local civilians. Guards were not universally saintly. Treatment varied with commanding officers and regional attitudes. But compared to the Eastern Front, where surrender often meant death, the difference was staggering. Even compared to German camps holding Western Allied prisoners, U.S. facilities reflected a different philosophy: victory by lawfulness. Strength through restraint, which made every Coca-Cola not merely a beverage, but a quiet declaration of values. Economics, labor, scarcity, and abundance behind every POW enjoying an ice cream cone stood an economic truth. The United States had more than enough. With millions of young men abroad, American agriculture and infrastructure needed replacement hands fast. German POWs became a crucial labor force, especially in rural states like Texas, Nebraska, and Iowa. It was a transaction wrapped in barbed wire. The U.S. received labor vital to the war effort. The German prisoners earned wages that directly funded canteen privileges. Local communities gained harvests and repaired roads. Prisoners relearned civilian skills and responsibilities for many U.S. civilians. The presence of German laborers felt almost surreal. These were the same men whose tanks once rolled proudly across Europe, now stooping in American fields, filling baskets with fruit. Scrip wages bought goods. Demand justified supply. That supply included soft drinks and, when refrigeration and delivery schedules allowed, ice cream. The cold sweetness wasn't an indulgence offered out of excess sympathy. It was business intersecting with morale policy. Abundance was a weapon, but one that struck softly. While Germany struggled under blockade and bombing, America functioned like a war machine with a candy factory attached. POWs couldn't ignore the contrast. Economic rhetoric back home, that the Reich was unassailable, resource-rich, destined to dominate, rang hollow when a bored guard casually tossed them treats like spare buttons. This economic asymmetry spoke louder than propaganda ever could. America didn't assert superiority through cruelty, it demonstrated it through capacity. And with every paycheck, every ice cube clinking in a camp cup, prisoners glimpsed the truth. They had been fighting a giant. Humanity, morality, and economics were reshaping minds, even if slowly. Yet beneath the pleasant surface, tensions simmered. Loyalty to the Reich did not simply evaporate in summer sunshine. The next set of angles will reveal the deeper struggles inside the wire: ideology, discipline, and the technology that made the impossible seem ordinary. Ideology and the battle for minds not. Every prisoner tasted Coca-Cola with excitement. Some tasted betrayal. Within the barracks, an invisible war raged between Nazi true believers and those simply tired of fighting. Hitler Youth veterans, SS ideologues, and devoted party members tried to maintain a miniature Reich behind the wire. They enforced silence during American news broadcasts. They monitored what men wrote in letters home. They punished defeatism. Canteen treats made their job harder. How do you preach enemy barbarism while eating enemy pastries? The U.S. noticed the cracks forming, and so emerged the Special Projects Division, a quiet campaign of reorientation. Their main weapon, information. They distributed German-language newspapers like Der Ruf, The Call, written by educated anti-Nazi POWs. It reported real war news, even Allied progress. Without rage or venom, films followed. Documentaries about democracy. Newsreels showing Germany's cities shattered by bombing. Evidence of Nazi crimes was introduced gradually. Too sudden a shock risked backlash. The goal wasn't humiliation, but awakening. Some prisoners scoffed. Others blinked hard at the screen. A few walked back to barracks staring at the ground. The most profound conversions were quiet. A man would take English lessons. He'd sign up for a woodworking class because he wanted a future that used hands instead of rifles. He'd stop saluting hardliners. Ideology didn't collapse overnight, but it began to erode from within, washed away by a tide of normalcy and choice and ice cream. Security, the fence. Within the fence, despite the comfort, these were still enemy soldiers. Inside the camps, danger lingered. Hardline Nazis formed secret groups, the Kameradschaft, who believed surrender itself was treason. They marked camp newspapers to indicate approved opinions. They threatened or assaulted those considered disloyal. In rare but chilling cases, they murdered their own. Thus, guards weren't only watching for escapes. They were watching for internal terror. The Americans responded with segregation camps, isolating high-risk ideologues from moderates, diffusing their influence. It wasn't perfect. Intimidation doesn't need bars to travel. But the walls of fear cracked alongside the walls of belief. Escape attempts still occurred. Some men dug hurried tunnels under fences. Others slipped away during farm work. A few succeeded in reaching distant cities, only to surrender after finding they couldn't hide among a population that viewed them with calm suspicion, not sympathy. Why return? Because survival outside the wire was harder than captivity inside it. The POWs learned something remarkable. Freedom isn't just the absence of fences. It's the presence of stability. And America provided that in abundance. Security, therefore, served two purposes: protection, preventing harm revelation, showing the enemy how trust operates in a lawful society. Even the guard towers, stoic symbols of confinement, became reminders that structure could exist without cruelty. Technology and the machinery of comfort in the Third Reich's propaganda, America was decadent, soft drinks and jazz while the world burned. But the irony was brutal. Here, drinks stayed cold because electricity never failed. Here, ice cream existed because refrigerated supply chains never broke. Here, canned goods, trucks, and rail schedules ran like clockwork. Technology didn't serve only soldiers, it served everyone. That shook many POWs to their core. In the Reich, modernity was often militarized. Tanks, rockets, U-boats. Civilian life fell behind. In America, technology was domestic strength first. Factories that built both bombers and soda caps. To a German soldier raised during scarcity, seeing a perfectly ordinary American kid eating ice cream on a Tuesday afternoon was like witnessing a paradox. The wealthy nation that could afford joy, and joy, shared or witnessed, undermined ideology far more effectively than a guard's rifle. Because what was the war about if not shaping the future? And whose future looked more worth living? Human hearts, moral principles, economic strength, informational pressure, internal conflicts, and technological superiority all converged in the American POW system. By 1945, these forces had formed a quiet storm inside the camps, a storm that reached its peak when the outside world, the war itself, finally shifted. The turning point was not one moment, but a cascade. A timeline of realization, and that is where we now go. Winter 1944-45 arrived with a cold that felt like truth. The prisoners knew the war was changing. Even the loyalists felt it. Rumors flowed faster than official updates. Rome was gone, Paris liberated, allies in the Low Countries, the Red Army closing in on Berlin. The news came over American radio, through camp newspapers, and in letters from home describing hunger and fear, not the victory promised by the Reich. Some camps allowed German-language papers created under U.S. oversight, such as Der Ruf, which reported Allied advances and questioned Nazi promises. It didn't scream propaganda. It simply showed reality. And reality was persuasive. The contradiction sharpened daily. Inside the wire, clean bunks, warm clothes, steady meals, cigarettes, and sometimes ice cream in midwinter thanks to reliable refrigeration. Outside the wire, cities burning, families displaced, the Reich shrinking. 3 moments defined the shift. Moment 1. A day in the fields, a work detachment harvesting sugar beets in Nebraska took a break. A farmer's wife brought out a tub of ice cream, homemade, rich with cream and sugar. She handed it to the prisoners with the same casual kindness she used toward the local boys. A Luftwaffe mechanic stared into the bowl, steam rising from his breath. He had been told Americans wanted to enslave Germany. Yet here he was, eating dessert on a stranger's farm, treated like hired help, not a monster. He later wrote home, "How can they hate us so little?" Moment 2. The newsreel one evening, The projector whirred in a dusty mess hall. POWs watched footage of German cities, entire neighborhoods flattened by bombing. There were no triumphant speeches, just ruins. Some shouted that it was staged. Others stared silently, fists clenched, not in anger, but in fear for their families. That night, conversation in the barracks broke into hushed pockets of uncertainty. What if everything is lost? What if we were wrong? Moment 3. Christmas, 1944. The guards set up a small tree. Prisoners received holiday meals matching American rations: turkey, potatoes, pies. At several large camps, Red Cross parcels arrived containing coffee, chocolate, and cigarettes. Meanwhile, from Germany, letters describing Christmas spent in basements during air raids. Celebration tasted like guilt. Comfort tasted like shame. Sweets tasted like surrender. Across the country, these moments repeated in different forms: movie nights, farm lunches, church visits, English classes, small acts of dignity. Each chipped away at the granite of Nazi indoctrination. Even the architecture of captivity felt civilized. The U.S. applied Geneva Convention rules aggressively: food rations, pay, medical care, protection from abuse, rules many. Germans now realized their own government ignored with Soviet POWs. Some prisoners experienced a quiet kind of humiliation. How had the enemy upheld German ideals of order and honor more faithfully than the Reich itself? The internal divide widened. Hardliners refused to acknowledge defeat, clinging to Hitler's promise of secret weapons and miraculous counterattacks. They threatened prisoners who looked too comfortable or curious. They insisted that Coca-Cola was poison, ice cream a bribe, but they were losing the narrative, because with every passing week, the outside war crept closer to the final truth, one no propaganda could bury. By early 1945, American guards didn't need to convince anyone of Allied superiority. Reality spoke louder than ideology. America had more food than it could consume, more factories than it could staff, more youth than it could send to the front. The war felt already decided inside those camps, long before the German High Command would admit the same. The change unfolded not as a single dramatic revelation, but as a slow surrender of certainty, a breaking of internal walls, a quiet, reluctant acceptance. Maybe the future did not belong to the Reich. Maybe the future looked more like this: a refrigerator humming in the background. And with that revelation, the prisoners stood not only at the edge of defeat, but at the threshold of transformation. Next comes the point where the internal shift becomes uncontainable. Spring, 1945, the war's final act. 4. German POWs in America. Each sunrise brought more undeniable proof. Germany was collapsing. Letters slowed. When they arrived, they came with shorter sentences and longer worries. Allied radios in guard towers reported Berlin surrounded. Even the most stubborn loyalists felt the dread tightening. Inside the wire, however, life continued with structured normalcy. Work details marched out. Mess halls clattered with trays. Canteens opened. And in many camps, ice cream deliveries resumed as the weather warmed, a jarring contrast to news of death and starvation at home. The shock intensified when American guards treated VE Day not with revenge, but relief. On May 8, 1945, some camps allowed prisoners to hear the announcement directly. A few listened in stunned silence. Others broke down, finally free to accept what they had known in their hearts for months. The war was over. Their cause had lost, and yet they were unharmed, fed, respected. Given dignity the Reich had denied so many others. This realization hit harder than any shell. Conversations that changed lives after surrender became official. American rules relaxed slightly. Camp libraries grew. Civilians visited more often. Farmers who had worked beside POWs invited them back for coffee after the day's labor. Many German soldiers experienced, for the first time, a society without fear, authority without brutality, prosperity without propaganda. They saw Americans argue about politics openly, even criticize their own government, without secret police waiting in the dark. One former Wehrmacht officer later said, "We discovered freedom not in victory, but in captivity." For younger POWs, especially those molded by Hitler youth schooling. This was revolutionary. Their entire worldview had been engineered to believe Germany was the pinnacle, culturally, technologically, morally. Yet in these camps, they learned to play baseball, strummed American guitars, and debated philosophy with chaplains and university volunteers. Humane treatment became something more powerful, and education in alternatives. The collapse of the hardliners as minds changed. Power shifted. Nazi loyalists lost their grip. The U.S. Army began sending the most committed ideologues to separate facilities, isolating them from moderates and reform-minded prisoners. Conversations in barracks turned open and honest. Men admitted doubts they once buried. They laughed at jokes they once called unpatriotic. Even small gestures, a prisoner buying a second helping of dessert, a man asking how to pronounce freedom in English, were signs of allegiance shifting from fear to curiosity. Some POWs joined anti-Nazi discussion groups fostered by the Special Projects Division. They wrote articles in Der Ruf encouraging democracy back home, describing what they had seen and how they had changed. Ideas no longer leaked. They spread. A future seen through a fence. By summer 1945, many POWs viewed America not as an enemy, but as an example. They studied its schools, its businesses, its communities. They admired the small things German propaganda never mentioned. The reliability of delivery trucks, the abundance of consumer goods, the casual expectation of comfort. The optimism of civilians untouched by dictatorship, a humble act of choosing a soda flavor in a canteen, cola or root beer, symbolized a world where choice itself was a right for a generation raised on marching orders. That was intoxicating. Some prisoners began to fear going home, not because of Allied punishment, but because home itself was unrecognizable now. Germany was rubble. Their families were hungry. A future there felt uncertain. In contrast, behind barbed wire, they had ice cream on Sunday, the mind's quiet surrender. The moment of ideological defeat rarely came in fanfare. It came in stillness, in reflection, in silence after lights out, staring at a barrack ceiling, holding a half-finished letter home. It came when a prisoner whispered to the man in the next bunk, "Maybe they are better than we were taught." It came when a guard tossed a baseball to a curious POW and taught him how to throw a curve. It came when a man stared at the POW scrip in his hand, realizing it brought more security than a Reichsmark ever had. It came in each cold, sweet bite of ice cream, a luxury made mundane. In that simplicity lay the most devastating truth. America didn't need to conquer their bodies anymore. It had conquered their expectations of a better life. This silent transformation among thousands of German soldiers would ripple far beyond the war's end, shaping the rebuilding of Germany itself, because captivity ended, but the lessons learned did not. Now that the turning point has played out, we must face the consequences for the prisoners, for the United States, and for the world reshaped by what happened behind those fences. War ends on paper long before it ends in people's lives. When Germany surrendered in May 1945, the United States suddenly possessed the largest collection of German POWs outside Europe, more than 400,000 scattered across over 600 camps. Repatriation was promised by international agreement, but the process was complicated by a devastated continent and unresolved labor needs. For months, many POWs remained exactly where they were, harvesting crops, repairing roads, tending to America's post-war economy while their own homeland lay in ruins. The Geneva Convention allowed retained labor only until practical repatriation, so the delay wasn't malicious, it was logistical. Feed the world or feed the rubble? The answer required patience. During this period, camp life subtly shifted from confinement toward preparation. Educational programs expanded. English classes filled every bench. Men learned carpentry, mechanics, agriculture, skills America believed would help rebuild Europe into a peaceful trading partner rather than a future adversary. Meanwhile, news of Germany's condition trickled in, cities flattened, industries leveled, families displaced, food scarce. The Reich's promises dissolved into ash and ration slips. In the camps, something astonishing happened. Homesickness mixed with dread. Prisoners found themselves worrying not about their own welfare, but about returning to a place that no longer existed as they remembered it. They feared being seen as failures or collaborators because they had lived in relative comfort while families suffered. Some guards noted the phenomenon. Men who once begged to leave now fear going home. Repatriation began gradually in late 1945. Trains rolled back east to ports like Newport News, where Liberty ships waited to carry the former enemy across the Atlantic once more, this time not as conquerors, but as humbled survivors. The United States followed repatriation rules with notable care. Adequate food for the journey. Personal belongings returned where possible. Final payments of POW scrip converted into modest funds. There were no victory parades. No jeering crowds. The U.S. wanted closure without humiliation, a clean end that preserved the dignity it had extended in captivity. By mid-1946, the majority of German POWs had departed American soil. A few remained longer due to illness, administrative errors, or reassignment to European labor contingents under British and French supervision. But the chapter of captivity in America had effectively closed. Numbers paint the structure of the aftermath, 425,000 plus. German POWs held in the U.S. spread across 600 plus camps nationwide. Most returned between late 1945 and 1946. A minority stayed in Europe through 1947 or longer as part of Reconstruction labor. Only a small number died in U.S. custody, a fraction consistent with normal mortality. Not abuse for an event so massive, it left surprisingly little scar tissue in America. Camps were dismantled quickly. Barracks returned to farmland, training grounds, or civilian use. Many communities remembered the POWs as polite workers who helped bring in the harvest when it mattered most. The prisoners carried a different memory. The war ended not when Germany fell, but when America treated them better than their own regime ever. Had their return would ignite profound changes, personal transformations and cultural bridges that shaped German society long after the camp gates closed. For thousands, America was not an episode to forget. It became a direction they would seek again, because the story didn't end when they left the wire. It followed them home. Europe was grey. When the German POWs returned after months, sometimes years, in America, they found a homeland unrecognizable. Streets they once marched down now curled beneath piles of brick and glass. Factories lay silent. Shops boarded. Food lines stretched around corners. The promises carved into every Nazi speech had vanished beneath Allied boots and famine. But inside many former POWs, something surprising came back across the ocean with them. Hope. They had glimpsed a society where ordinary people expected stability, where the government served the public, not the party, where prosperity was not propaganda, but a product of freedom and organization. Some returned determined to help Germany rebuild in that image, and they did, seeds planted, behind barbed wire veterans who had once followed. Dictatorship now advocated democracy. They had learned cooperation, not coercion. They had learned American work habits. They had read Der Ruf, debated ideas, and discovered that disagreement did not require fear. Many brought back better English than they ever expected to know. Practical skills from labor assignments, an understanding of productivity and efficiency, new perspectives on freedom and responsibility. A saying emerged quietly among them. I learned the meaning of Germany and America. Writers, teachers, builders. The intellectual transformation was especially strong among those involved in the Special Projects Division and the Der Ruf Initiative. Some later became part of Group 47, writers who reshaped post-war German literature and pushed the country to confront its past. Others became teachers, engineers, business owners. They built houses, designed storefronts, and staffed the factories of the Wirtschaftswunder, the economic miracle that lifted West Germany from the ruins. They insisted on efficiency they had seen firsthand in the U.S., where logistics didn't collapse under pressure, and many of them, during long workdays and cold train rides back home, clutched a small object, a reminder of a life they didn't expect to love, a Coca-Cola bottle cap. a canteen token, a flattened American cigarette tin, proof that the enemy had treated them well. Bridges. Instead of barriers, when the Cold War hardened political lines, former POWs became quiet diplomats. They knew Americans not as occupiers but as individuals, farmers, guards, chaplains, workers. They had spoken with them, labored beside them, laughed with them. So when American officials arrived to help rebuild West German institutions, there were fewer walls of suspicion. Former POWs served as translators, not just of language, but of trust. Thousands applied to emigrate. Many succeeded. They settled in places like Texas, Minnesota, and Wisconsin, states where they had once cut wheat or split timber under guard. They built families there, cafes, bakeries, and every so often one would remark with a small smile, "I first tasted freedom in captivity, memory without hatred. Not every man loved his time in America." Some suffered under the shadow of defeat. Others never quit believing in the lost Reich. Trauma and guilt lingered. War left no soul untouched. But the overall legacy was extraordinary. POWs committed fewer crimes after returning home than average citizens. Many held favorable views of the U.S. for the rest of their lives. The humane captivity became a cornerstone of U.S.-German reconciliation, what began as a logistical necessity, storing enemy soldiers far from the front, ended as a psychological triumph. The Americans had achieved something rare in warfare. They turned enemies into witnesses to a better way of life. Those witnesses then helped rebuild a nation. And in the quiet closing of this chapter, as barracks emptied and fences came down, a final truth emerged, one that continues to echo across generations. Kindness doesn't erase war, but it can help prevent the next one. Now, with the consequences evident across continents and decades, all that remains is the reflection, what this story means beyond dates and documents. The story of German POWs in America isn't about ice cream or Coca-Cola. Not really. It's about what those simple, everyday comforts revealed. In war, enemies imagine each other as monsters. Propaganda paints in black and white. Fear fills in the rest. But captivity in the United States forced German soldiers to confront a contradiction. The people they had been told to despise treated them with dignity, often with unexpected generosity. A scoop of ice cream became evidence of something larger. A system strong enough to remain humane. A nation secure enough to choose restraint. A society confident enough to share abundance with those who once threatened it. These small luxuries showed the prisoners that freedom is not chaos, and comfort is not weakness. It is the product of order, rights, laws, and cooperation, and perhaps most importantly, choice. America didn't win these men through punishment. It didn't demand their loyalty or crush their identity. It simply presented a different future and let them decide what to believe. Many never forgot that. Long after they returned to Germany, rebuilt it, and watched it rise from ruins into prosperity, the memory lingered. A long wooden counter, glass bottles sweating in summer heat, a taste of cold sweetness in the middle of a burning world. It's a reminder that sometimes the strongest message isn't delivered by armies or declarations, but by a quiet moment of kindness, inside a place built for war. History often focuses on the battles that destroy. This story belongs to the small mercies that rebuild.